Alrighty, Calum. So yeah, one of the articles here is really just first off your take on Final Fantasy VII. So the remake released on Friday. I've been hearing a lot about it. It's been taking over my Twitter feed. A lot of high praise and some
Yeah.
controversy with like how they've changed stuff. So let's go. Let's keep the spoiler stuff at the end. But like, what are your first impressions of this remake?
So up until the last sort of hour or so of the game, I absolutely adored it. I mean, it's probably one of the best Final Fantasy games I've played, in terms of gameplay, its soundtrack, the story's done really well. It looks amazing. And it takes lots of, because with Final Fantasy 15, which I didn't enjoy very much, I felt like that just left everything that people enjoyed about Final Fantasy behind. So it gave it like a huge sandbox open world. It took away any tactical point of combat. It just put in loads of like fetch quests, and it took out magic as well, which is like a huge part of the sort of Final Fantasy combat as well. And whereas this Final Fantasy, in terms of like game mechanics, I feel like they've really scoured through previous entries, taken like cherry picked features from them and implementing them into this. So for example, the combat in itself is very different to lots of Final Fantasy games. It's one of the best combat systems, I think, maybe even the best combat system I've seen in Final Fantasy. But they've taken the stagger system from Final Fantasy 13, which basically means when you're attacking an enemy, you can build up this bar that after the bar's full, it staggers them and then they take more damage and things like that, which is always a really fun mechanic to have. Its systems, like its weapon upgrades, how you upgrade your characters they're all like the perfect depth. It's not too much, and it's really easy to understand. But it does give you a lot of customization. For example, like your weapons, you like find lots of different weapons for each character, and they all share a pool of like upgrade points. So you never have to worry about which weapon you're using. You'll still get to upgrade it. So it's quite nice in that respect. And it takes staying on sort of the weapons as well. It takes a mechanic from Final Fantasy 9, which is my favorite Final Fantasy, which is basically every weapon has a unique ability, but once you've used that weapon and that ability that's tied to it enough, or you've done certain things, you'll become proficient in that ability, which means that you don't need to use that weapon to use that ability. So it means that it means that you're still like it still wants you to use all these different weapons and try them out, because some of them act differently to others. But if that weapon isn't quite the playstyle you like, then all you need to do is use it, fill this criteria to unlock its proficiency, and then you've now got that weapon's ability and you can use it on all the other weapons as well. So
That's a really cool
so yeah,
idea.
so it's really good, and that was last seen in Final Fantasy 9, and it was really good just because it gives you a reason to try out all the equipment,
Right.
And it sort of, because I don't know if you agree, but in other RPGs, like you'll just hoard all this armor and all these weapons, and you'll just end up selling them all because the stats aren't quite
Right.
as good as what you're currently wearing. Whereas having these specific abilities tethered to these like bits of equipment, it persuades you to use other things just so that you can unlock these abilities, and by doing that you're basically fleshing out your character's arsenal of abilities and things like that. Yep. So I feel like in terms of like design, I feel like they've really gone back to other games in the series and taken a lot of cherry pick some really good things rather than trying to really go in a new direction to try and cater to everybody, which is what they did with 15, I feel. But I mean, that was just the gameplay, really. The gameplay is what I think makes it so impressive, and I think it's just a real masterclass in that area. But yeah, it's I don't really know where to go, because there's just so much I could like gush about.
Well, with the gameplay itself, any issues anything that rubbed you the wrong way, or are they kind of nailing it with what they've decided to leave behind and improve on?
So there was one thing that rubbed me the wrong way at first, and that was the like AI of the characters you're with. I felt that, because you sort of have to attack to fill up your ATB meter, which lets you use your abilities and lets you use items and lets you use spells. And at first, I felt that whoever you weren't controlling, their ATB would go up really, really slowly. So if you were sort of, invested in attacking this certain enemy, and then you were waiting for one of your AI partners' ATB goals to fill up so they could heal you or do something whilst you're doing something else, it was very difficult to do because their meters would fill up so slowly. But I realised as the game went on that it wants you to switch between characters often. So,
Gotcha.
and as soon as I started doing that and becoming more accustomed to that, it actually made the combat feel a lot better, because I was sort of getting used to, looking at my different characters' ATB gauges, seeing who needed to sort of increase it, quick switching to them, and then as soon as you switch to them, someone else's might have filled, but they've got that quick command button, so it all just like falls into place really.
Nice.
In that respect, and but no, I mean, I think the side quests in the game are kind of, they feel a bit like filler. They don't do a huge amount for the game. And I think that, I mean, this isn't a criticism for me, but a lot of criticism a lot of people have is that it feels quite linear. But I prefer that, honestly. I like it when story-driven games are linear, because you can never upset the pace yourself. So you can never like go off and do lots and lots of things when really that the main story you have like 5 minutes to do something, but you've just spent 3 hours doing loads of side quests kind of thing.
Right.
But on that point, where there are side quests, there's only like 3 sections in the game, or like three or four like chapters, where you'll get to a point and then there'll be some side quests you can do. And I think that's a really good way to do it, because like I said, that it allows the story to sort of decide when it's linear and when it isn't. So it just means that it's constantly paced how it should be. And yeah, I just think that it's I think it's better to be linear than to be open world and let you sort of wreak havoc on everything, when there should really be there is a story that is trying to be told at the same time as well.
Right. And I wonder too, with them building, because with this first part of this remake, you're kind of, from what I understand, you're limited to one area. So I feel like the devs were kind of wanting to give you the idea or the ability to explore, but still kind of keep you on track to hit these story beats. But still, because they fully expanded on, is it Midgar, that first area?
Yes, yeah.
So they've expanded on it so much, apparently, that they need to give you, a kind of a breadcrumb way to get through it, but still let you explore around.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing. I mean, the Midgar section in the original Final Fantasy VII is linear anyway, and there's no free roaming around in Midgar in the original.
Yeah.
But I think after playing the remake, I think that there was just so much visual storytelling to do with Midgar. With the plates in the sky, the slums that are underneath the plate, just this huge, like, amazing science fiction designed city that on Final Fantasy VII they couldn't really get across, because of it was a product of its time, and you can't really you can have text boxes explaining what the city looks like, and you can have these weird like cutscenes and drawn static backgrounds, but you really can't visually describe what the city's like. So I think that there was just so much to show and to do and to say about Midgar, that I think that it needed to be fleshed out like this. It had to be done in this way to really give it the sort of description it deserves.
Yeah, that's awesome. I wonder too, as I hear people describe this, as you describe this, it seems like this part of the game is so huge, what they've done. It makes me then wonder, how big will this complete game be? Like, if this is just this first chunk, and eventually we'll start hearing more about this part 2. How big can we expect this entire experience to be? If you've already said you're around 30-ish hours with this first part 1, I can't imagine how it's going to be when it's all said and done.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a big one, and it's difficult, because you look at games like, you got like Persona 5 Royal, which is supposed to be like 100 and odd hours to finish, games like Red Dead 2, which is like 80 hours. Some of the other Final Fantasy games are sort of 60 and above hours as well. But I feel that that a lot of those games are fleshed out by side things, and a lot like more sort of things that are quicker to create, but they take time for the player to do. Whereas I feel like Final Fantasy 7 remakes are very specific experience. Every single part of the game is completely like over designed, and you always feel like you're getting like 100% production value in every single part, whether that's the web, the NPCs around you, and it's not like Red Dead 2 where it's a fully realized realistic world. I mean, it is still very Japanese in ways, and it's still very there are parts where you sort of like recoil and cringe, but there's just something about it. It just feels very like they've put a lot of effort into this world and into it, and you can just really feel that.
Right, and that's part of the charm. I mean, you wouldn't want, just like we talk about RE, the Resident Evil franchise, you wouldn't want to fully remove its weirdness. So like you have to, especially when you're doing a remake like this, you have to make sure you balance that with the right amount of what that secret sauce, that thing that's always there. So you can't get rid of that. those times when you cringe. I mean, you got to lean in at certain points. How do you feel about some of the characters themselves, as far as like the story, how they've written some of the characters? I know we talked about them kind of revising. There's that tank of a dude who's like in your party. I know they kind of revised him dialogue wise, and like how have they fully fleshed out these characters?
So really, really well. I mean, like I said to you, I played the original Final Fantasy 7 quite, about in the last like 2 years or so for the first time, and the characters for me were not quite the strongest characters in Final Fantasy I'd seen. They a lot of the time it was hard to get a feel, because you could tell that they were really trying to tell like a really deep psychological story at times, and it's just sometimes quite difficult to get that across with these weird character models and just the text boxes. But they've really just given so many dimensions to these new characters. I mean, Barrett, who's the leader of Avalanche, he's still this really like burly, aggressive guy, but he shows his passion, and you can really feel that he's like in charge of this group. And Cloud is they really play onto his sort of like mental issues, which is the big plot twist of the original. And there's a lot of times where you really feel like he's like really not very nice. Like that, I remember there's a side quest where you help some old guy who wants to visit his wife's grave or something, and I can't remember what it is, but I think Cloud asks him for like 4,000 gil to do something. And I was waiting for like the character who's with you at the time to sort of butt in and then make it all okay, but it just ends on this really sour note. And Tifa and Aerith, the two sort of main female characters, they're awesome. They're both very different as well, which I think is quite hard to distinguish sometimes in the older Final Fantasy games. Aerith is this really sort of like fun, quirky character who sort of like she knows that Cloud gets annoyed easily, so she's always trying to like wind him up. And then you've got Tifa, who's this sort of quite nurturing but like really hardy character as well. And then you've got the three Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse, who played a really minor role in the original, but they've been fleshed out completely, and they've all got their own dimensions to them, and you really get to know a bit about each of them, and it's just really fleshed out the characters so well, and the characters that you play with and fight with, they're all so that they're so well designed. They all feel different. They all have their own unique pros and cons, and because that's another problem I had with the original Final Fantasy 7 was. I love it in Final Fantasy or just RPGs in general, where you have characters that are like dedicated roles. So you've got your tank, you've got your white mage, you've got your black mage, you've got so like you've got your healer, and you've got your warrior or whatever. It's nice to have these sort of specific roles for each of your characters, so you know exactly how to upgrade them and how to use them in battles. And the original Final Fantasy, you could just make everybody exactly the same, really. There wasn't a whole lot of customization in that respect. But in the remake, Tifa is extremely powerful and fast, and she's got, because everyone has their own unique abilities. She's a really good, like, aggressive attacker. You got Cloud, who's quite sort of versatile. He can, as long as he's sort of like up front of his sword, he can sort of do anything. You got Barrett, who's a tank, and quite a good support class. So they've really sort of given each character like a specific role as well, but not too obvious. So you still have to experiment and play around and find out who's best at what. So yeah, I think the characters are another one of the sort of real real good things about the remake. They've really done a solid job in bringing them to life in sort of a new vein.
Now, from what I understand, there's some kind of all I interpret from this remake is like what I see on Twitter is people like freaking out, loving it. But from what I understand, there's some kind of like crazy decision you have to make with two of the female characters. Is that a thing? Because I feel like I keep seeing these memes of people saying like, "Oh, if you don't choose her, like, you know, you're crazy. If you don't choose her, you're crazy." Like, is there something going on there?
I think that's just like people deciding who they like the most out of the female characters.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I've seen a lot of stuff like that as well. Yeah, no, I don't think there's any sort of big choices like
Gotcha.
like that in the game. But it is quite funny because you've got these three female characters and they all seem to like love Cloud, and he just doesn't seem to like anyone.
Right.
So it's quite
too cool.
fun dynamic to see. Yeah. But yeah, no, I've seen a lot of stuff like that as well.
Now, with your time, you said you've completed it so far at this point. So, do you feel now at the end of it, there's been so much build to this Final Fantasy VII remake, you've completed it. Do you feel like they supplied enough to withstand all the hype and the long waits and tackling a remake in the first place? Are you satisfied with this first part?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely hit the mark. I think it's definitely a incredible game, and it'll go, and for the right or wrong reasons, it's going to be the talk on everyone's lips for a long time. And like or hate the ending, I think there's still going to be a real, what's going to happen next kind of vibe for the next part. But the real difference I noticed was it's really not a remake in the way it was marketed. Well, maybe not marketed, but in the way people assumed it to be. It reminds me a little bit of, how you've got like the different Spider-Man films,
like a reboot,
and how, yeah, exactly. So, and I mean, I see a lot of people saying they shouldn't call it a remake. I think remake's still the right term because it's remaking, the story for this game.
right?
But yeah, I mean that it's very very much that world and them characters and that situation, and then just a new direction. I mean, it does follow a lot of the story beats of the original, but it especially towards the end, it really changes things up. And at first, I didn't mind, the additions and the sort of different directions it was going in. But towards the end, when it ended in a certain way, I wasn't sure how to think about it. But but now I've sort of had some time to think, sort of dwell on it. I think it's quite good because it means that if this had come out and it was a beat for beat remake, fleshed out, but still had the same story beats and everything happened the same way, it would make the original Final Fantasy VII just completely worthless. Like, no one would have a reason to play it, because this new one's out and it tells the story the same way. But the way this has gone, the original Final Fantasy VII remake still is worth playing despite the remake as well, because they really do towards the end go off in different directions. So it took me a while to sort of absorb the shock of the ending, but now I'm quite excited because I don't know what's going to happen now. It's kind of like I don't know what's to come now. It's a real new telling of this story. So although it sort of took away my initial excitement to see all these things recreated, I then sort of got a new excitement for sort of the unknown that's going to come.
Nice. Yeah, that's really good to hear. Especially, I'm not a huge fan of this franchise, but like I always loved it,
Mhm.
respected that people have so much fun with it, and so
Yeah.
that makes me happy that they're willing to change it enough to like refresh the energy for this whole thing. Because otherwise, it's
Mhm.
almost like artistically, why tackle it if you're just remaking it completely? Yeah, it looks better,
Yeah.
it plays better, that's fine, but also you want to take a little bit of a chance and kind of, because you can't
Yeah.
erase the original, it's there like you mentioned, and now you have
Mhm.
more of an incentive to play it because it's a different now storyline a little bit with how they end that.
Mhm.
So I like that they're willing to take this chance, and it seems to be working by twisting it a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's very clever how they've done it as well. And there's a story element throughout the game that's completely new, but you don't realize till the end what it actually is there for. So it is quite clever in how they've done that. It's kind of like one big metaphor in a way to show like that now this first game's out the way. That Square can now really do whatever they want with this and take it in any direction they want. You'd imagine that. I mean, I still would like them to at least um, follow certain massive story beats of the original, just because it's a big part of the story and the characters in the world. You still want to see certain locations, you
Right.
still want to see certain characters, you still want to see certain plot elements recreated. Um, but yeah, I think it's exciting and it's clever. It's just a clever way of doing it, I think. And I mean, we can go into that in a bit more detail if you like,
Yeah, let's
maybe
let's
later
transition
on.
there.
But
So I'll put up a
yeah,
little
yeah, yeah,
disclaimer. We're now going into
yeah,
spoiler territory, but
yeah.
so now explain to me, I guess throughout the not only the ending, but let's start with throughout the game. What have they changed that
Mhm.
is somewhat of a spoilery thing? Then that
Yeah.
leads up to that new change at the end.
Yeah. So immediately the thing that that seems to be quite different is Sephiroth, the main, well, one of the sort of main villains of the original. He doesn't show up at all until sort of the end of Midgar, and he's
Mm.
even then he's not in it very often. But he's like a real staple of the story throughout, through Cloud having flashbacks and things like that, where he sees Sephiroth, and I didn't mind that because it is sort of like laying the groundwork for their like relationship. And then he comes at the same time he does in the original, but then towards the end you have like this very like anime style Kingdom Hearts kind of like fight with Sephiroth,
Oh,
which I just felt like they've sort of like now raised the bar really high. Um, I think it would have been better to have these flashbacks, have Sephiroth show up, but then leave him until later in the later games, because it's sort of like he shows up and you fight him, and the music plays as the same as the final boss fight in the original. He has his like wing, which you don't even see till the very end of the game
oh,
in the original, and it just sort of like accelerates really quickly and makes him a huge part of this game when I don't really think he had to be. I think there was plenty of stuff there to just let him be in the background, let these flashbacks happen, uh, and really build him up and build this rivalry between Cloud and Sephiroth up for maybe the next games. But so I feel like they could have maybe shown a bit of restraint there. Um, but the biggest change is these enemies called Whisperers. I don't know if you've heard
no.
anything about them yet, but they're not at all in the original, and they're basically these like ghostly hooded things that show up from the beginning of the game, and they show up all the way throughout, and they show up at certain times, and you can't quite tell whether they're good or evil. Sometimes they come and they like help you,
Mm.
because they sort of like get rid of a bad guy or stop a bad guy from doing something, or they'll get in your way and stop you from doing something.
Huh.
So they just sort of like show up here and there, and then at the end, so this is a big spoiler, and it's from here where things really start taking the real turn to change the story. And this is like the last two chapters. You find out that these whisperers are they basically control fate, so they're there to make sure that everyone stays on a certain path, to like fulfill some destiny or whatever. Mm-hmm. So if something's going to happen that isn't the right fate or isn't the right destiny, they'll intervene and make sure this path happens. So for example, Barrett gets killed by Sephiroth, and that doesn't happen at all in the original. I mean, Barrett survives all the way through, but then he's brought back to life by these whisperers, these harbingers of fate, because he's not destined to die there or whatever, which was all fine and whatever. But so from there, you then all this stuff with Sephiroth happens, and you're trying to like chase him out of the city, but these big harbingers of fate come down and they stop you from leaving. So in classic sort of Final Fantasy style, you have to fight the harbinger of fate, like this big like final boss kind of monster, and he spawns all these like these four like other harbingers, and they're quite cool. They're typical JRPG final bosses, and
yeah,
it was a pretty cool little boss fight. And then so once you kill them, you're free of these whisperers. You're free of this like this path that they're trying to make you go down. And then so after all that happens, and it sort of starts playing the ending cutscene, it shows. I don't know if you heard of Zack, who's one of the Final Fantasy characters.
No, that's maybe the more normal sounding guy I've ever heard from Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
No, I haven't heard of that guy.
So this is like a...
He does their taxes or something, or what does he do?
Yeah, yeah. So this is a big part of like the plot twist in Final Fantasy VII, the original, is that Cloud isn't who he thought he was. He was basically a typical infantry soldier, and then this Zack was who Cloud thought he was.
Oh.
Who Cloud thought himself was, and basically Cloud and Zack were friends, and they both got experimented on, but then Zack gets killed, and it's a really like emotional, powerful scene when Zack dies. He takes on like all these soldiers and gets killed, and then he passes on his sword to Cloud, like the big Buster sword.
Oh, right.
Cloud has, because that was actually Zack's sword. Passes it on to Cloud, and then Cloud then wanders into Midgard just aimlessly because he's sort of still suffering from this like poisoning and all of this. And from there, he sort of tries to piece together his memories, and where he has these gaps, he sort of takes Zack's life and merges it with his own. And so it's all just this really confusing thing. But anyway, and so after you kill these harbingers of fate, it shows Zack, and it shows the scene where he dies, but he survives.
Oh.
So it's kind of like an alternate timeline kind of thing, because
Gotcha.
he obviously doesn't survive in the timeline of the game because Cloud's there with the sword and everything, and then all this stuff happens. Then it ends, and it says the unknown journey will continue.
Whoa.
So it's basically what you realise at the end is that these whisperers were there trying to make sure that the characters followed the same path as the original storyline.
Right.
So that's where it's kind of quite clever and metaphoric or whatever. But so these whisperers were there to try and make sure this original storyline, the path of that stayed true. That's why when Barrett got killed, he got resurrected by them. There's a point where this scientist is about to reveal to Cloud his history, which would have been way earlier than the original, and these whisperers come in, whisk him away so he can't say anything else. So now that they're gone, it's sort of basically saying that it's now a completely new path, and it's going to be completely different.
Wow.
So
that's really cool.
So I've tried to explain it without, because the problem is with Final Fantasy VII is there's so many story beats that are relevant to this. And I mean, if you haven't played the original, then they wouldn't be. But to properly explain the reason the ending's so divisive and strange, you have to sort of try and go off on these tangents to try and explain all these other things, and I think that's where it's very divisive, because it just overcomplicates things, and and it's just it was just a lot to take in, really, a lot to sort of digest. So yeah, I can see why a lot of people were a bit miffed, because people have been expecting a remake of a story they love, and they might not now be getting that. It'll be the same world, same characters, obviously, but it's not necessarily gonna follow the same beat. And I think the fact that you see Zack alive at the end is really rubbing people the wrong way, because his death is like one of the real powerful, like, emotional scenes from Final Fantasy VII, from that sort of lore. And so for people to see that, I think a lot of people just see it as like a big middle finger to the fans who have been waiting for this, which I understand, but at the same time, I'm quite excited to see this new direction they take it in. So yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely going to go down as one of the biggest, like, what the fuck moments in games, but it's hopefully going to come good, and all we can do now is wait and see what they do.
Yeah, no, that's pretty interesting to hear, especially with you have the harbingers.
Yeah, something like that.
Whisper guys, I'm gonna call them the Whisper guys.
Yeah.
I like that idea, because that gives them the ability to acknowledge the traditional storyline and then deviate and give you a reason why it changes in the first place, because you kill them or remove them. That's super interesting. And the fact that they end it with that other dude being alive, do you think, is there a way for them to interact where they both exist, or would they alternate between the reality where Zack is alive and then Cloud is alive?
So that's what's very confusing. So when you see Zack alive, because just for a little bit of clarity, there's a game called Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, which came out on PSP, and that is kind of like a prequel to Final Fantasy VII. It ends literally just where Final Fantasy VII begins, and that follows Zack and Cloud and Sephiroth, because those three were sort of fought together. And it just basically goes more into detail with this. And there's a cutscene, and the cutscene from Crisis Core is the cutscene where Zack dies, and it just adds this huge, like, emotional thing to it, because it's PSP games had fairly decent graphics, and the cutscene is a good, really good sort of ending scene to watch. And they basically recreate that scene at the end. But yeah, he survives, and then they're sort of the characters who you're controlling in the game, because you just come out of Midgar now. They're basically walking where he sort of is in this alternate timeline but survived. So they, like, walk past each other, but obviously in different timelines or different universes, whatever. So I can't imagine. I'm imagining that in this timeline that you play in the remake, that Zack does die how he did before, because otherwise I don't know how Cloud would have his sword.
It's true.
But yeah, it's very confusing, and everyone now really doesn't know what this means. And yeah, but like you said, I think to sort of come away and look at it from the perspective that they've written in these new enemies that are basically a metaphor for change. They're basically a metaphor that they're trying to keep this story on the same rails as the original, but they've now freed themselves from that story.
Right.
To look at it from that perspective, it is quite clever, and it's very submersive, so it's sort of like, or subversive, so it's really sort of taking people by surprise. Which I think is cool, because it adds just some discussion to it, and it's such a big remake. It just adds some flavour to it, and adds some excitement and buzz, and is really gonna love it. Like I said, love it or hate it, people are gonna be looking out for what this means for the next part. So it's really grown on me. I'm really excited to see what happens now.
Now, do you think that, and we'll have to wait years, I imagine, to see this actually come to life, but, like, do they now create this option to remake more than just 7, maybe 8, because they're creating an alternate path for all the games to now go down? Do you think that's a possibility, or really they just want to give these different scenarios for the 7 remake?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that because they've got Tetsuya Nomura writing it, who did Kingdom Hearts and the original Final Fantasy VII. They've also got some other original writers from the original game. So I feel like it might just be that, because I'd imagine if you write something as big as Final Fantasy VII, you'd probably with the years that pass, you'd probably be like, oh, what if this happened instead? What if I did this differently?
Yep.
What if this character did this? And I'm sure there's many ideas they scrapped for other ones, and so I don't know whether it's just them wanting to take this world and just take it in a different direction, or just add things that they wanted to add to it, or add these pipeline dreams that they've had over the years after the original one came out. Because as much as I don't think the original Final Fantasy VII is the strongest one, I think it definitely has the most interesting story and interesting world to really pull apart and flesh out. So I don't know, in terms of remaking other Final Fantasies, because I'd like to see a Final Fantasy 16 next, or whether they're going to do Final Fantasy 7 Remake 2 next or whatever. But you do sort of wonder whether how many of these can they make, and what would they have to sacrifice to make them. But in terms of Final Fantasy 8 and 9, I think have aged. I mean, Final Fantasy 9 certainly. I mean, I could play that, the remake for that on PS, or the remaster on PS4 for that, and it's fine. I mean, that came out just before PS2, so it's not too bad to look at, and it plays really well. And then the 2D Final Fantasies, I think because they're 2D, they'll just forever be okay to play and look at.
Right.
So I think Final Fantasy VII, for quite a lot of reasons, not just the fact that it has a really good story that wasn't able to maybe be told in a way that it should have been, but also because it has aged horribly. But yeah, I mean, I'd be happy with any Final Fantasy remake. I love them. I love them all, and especially the older ones. And to see them remade like this would be awesome. But yeah, I don't know if it'd be quite a lot to sort of take in, especially if they did sort of different story routes for each one.
Yeah, it's interesting because we are in a different time now where these remakes are now possible. They come out and they're actually really good. So, but it doesn't also mean that we have to then go chronologically for all these. Like even with we'll talk about RE4 and RE3 remakes. It's like it doesn't necessarily have to be go in line now with every game that came out in its proper order and remake those. Like sometimes you have to tackle the ones that have the most demand or deserve it the most. Like it doesn't always have to be. You have to start from the beginning, go to the end. It's like, and also financially, they have to pick the ones that are going to sell the best too to actually remake in the first place.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And I think Final Fantasy VII is the most financially attractive game for them to remake as well. I mean, it's probably the most popular Final Fantasy.
Right.
That and 10, I'd probably say. But yeah, it's a tough one. I'm sure that I'm sure it's a conversation they'd have about remaking the other ones. But I mean, if I was to see one remade, I'd love to see 6 remade, because that is just such an awesome story as well, and that has probably my favorite villain from Final Fantasy in it, called Kefka, who's he's like a clown jester, and he basically kills his own emperor, and then just becomes like this, like really, he's like one of those villains that is just evil for no reason, a bit like the Joker. Like gotcha. He's just so evil that he doesn't even have like a reason, and that sort of makes him even more evil. But yeah, so I'd love to see Final Fantasy 6, but again, that's just like a fantasy, really. It's I'm happy with what they've done with the remake. I'm happy to see what they bring out next, and I'm hoping that the way they've handled this game in terms of its gameplay and how it plays, how they've done the combat system, how they've done just the general game systems and how you level up, I'm hoping that is a good thing. A good thing to sort of look at for the next Final Fantasy mainline game 16. I'm hoping that they will go more down this line of letting the story dictate how linear or open world the game is, and just really designing the combat system as well as they did, because 15 was just such a different game. It just didn't feel like Final Fantasy at all, whereas this really does.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, it seems like across the board, it's been not only critically acclaimed, it's selling well. People are really digging it, so it's a great just burst or boost to the franchise itself. To have this thing out there now.
Yeah, and I mean, and there's so many other things that I could gush about, and it's just one of those games. I just can't recommend it enough. It is so impressive. It's really special. The soundtrack is just amazing. The way the story's told is brilliant, and even for a Japanese like localized game, even the performances are good. And I mean, there's some things like with NPCs where lines are a bit strange or don't really sort of fit very well. But I mean, in terms of the main cast, I'd say like 90% of the cutscenes and the acting and everything, it seems really good and really powerful and tells the story really well, which is hard to do with a sort of native Japanese game. Um, so yeah, I mean, I just can't recommend it enough. Even it doesn't feel like a JRPG; it feels like an action RPG, which is probably why you enjoyed the demo.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is a really special game. And yeah, it is very good. And the change to the story means that I don't think that you have to play the original before playing the remake, or vice versa. I think it would help. Just it'd help you understand the ending and all the buzz about it. But I mean, it is on its own. It is just such a excellent game.
Gotcha. Nice. Yeah. I don't know if I'll ever jump in, but it's all positive things that I'm hearing, good things that I'm hearing.
Yeah,
So that's
yeah.
really great.